Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have you here again for another conference for our Center of European and German Studies from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, together with the PUC, the Catholic University from Porto Alegre. And today we have the great honor to welcome the President of the International Association of Consumer Law, dear colleague, Professor Dr. Michelle Kelly-Louw from the University of South Africa, that will speak for us in a very special issue, the debt relief initiatives from South Africa consumers. So we are very happy with this opportunity to begin and to continue this dialogue with our colleagues from South Africa, that I may say as a general rapporteur, our reform of the Consumer Protection Code, we use this very interesting piece of legislation from South Africa as an example how it's possible to include a large part of the population in the credit system. So I'm really thrilled to hear more about the debt relief initiatives now within this pandemic time. So thank you very much to be that you are with us. And I give the floor to our LLM student, Marcela Joelson, that will present our invited. Please.
Professor Michelle, thank you so much. It's a great honor to have you here with us. So for our students, I'll talk a little bit about Michelle. She's a research professor of law at the University of South Africa. She holds a doctoral degree in international banking law. She has published widely in the fields of insolvency law, banking law, and consumer credit law, and her research has been cited with approval by South Africa courts, including the Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court of Appeal on several occasions. She has received five research awards, including the South Africa Department of Science and Technologies Award for Distinguished Young Woman Scientist, academic excellence in social sciences as well. Through her career, she has been extensively involved in the drafting of legislation, including the Land and Agricultural Development Bank Act 15 of 2002, the Unified Insolvency and Business Recovery Bill of 2003, the new South African Deeds Registries Act and Sectoral Titles Act, and also the Financial Misconduct Regulations. She was a visiting research fellow at the University of Westminster, London, and research fellow at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies in London. She is the president of the International Association of Consumer Law, and she is a member of various South African and international law journals. Professor Michelle, please, you can start your speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcela. Today we'll talk about the debt relief initiatives. As Professor Marcus has indicated, it's very topical now with the pandemic, putting stress on all of our debts. Just as an overview, I'll give you the discussion of South Africa, the debt measurements we have. In South Africa, consumer credit is regulated by the South African National Credit Act. It's an act that came into effect in 2006 and 2007. It was phased into phases, first creating the regulator, and then the full act came into operation. Now, before the act came into operation, we had two formal mechanisms to deal with alleviation of debt. The first one was an administration order. We still have that. That is regulated by the South African Magistrates Courts Act, which is our lowest court in South Africa. And I'll get to that process in a little bit, but there the debt must be capped, and it's only limited debt that is covered by that process. And in practice, it's been a failure. It's also really unregulated with the administrators. So it wasn't really an adequate form, and it still is not an adequate form or mechanism to relieve the debt of South African consumers. The other one is the filing of insolvency or bankruptcy. In South Africa, we refer to that as sequestration process. And that has two arms. Either a creditor can sequestrate you or file for the bankruptcy of an individual. And there's a list of requirements. For example, he has a claim, the consumer or the debtor is insolvent, etc. Or the consumer himself can file for the bankruptcy. Now, in South Africa, that is a creditor-friendly process. It's not really a process that caters for consumers or debtors. And if a consumer or a debtor wants to bring that application to sequestrate himself to get out of debt, he needs to prove that there is a benefit for his creditors. Now, you can see that is a problem, because usually a bankruptcy, when you file for bankruptcy, how do you prove that it's going to be to their benefit, especially if you have a consumer that has no assets and no income? And we work on a certain percentage of the cent in a rand, and that's not really successful for many consumers, where they end up being too poor to file for bankruptcy. Now, if we look at the administration order, as I said, that has been a failed process. It's still available, and it's capped to debts not exceeding 50,000 South African rand. In terms of Brazilian real, it will be 15,800, so it's not a large amount. And to go for administration order, it's through the courts. They appoint an administrator, but you need an income to file for administration orders. If you have no money to repay, you can't use the process. And one big flaw in this process is it doesn't cover in future debts. So where you have installments, for example, a mortgage bond. So it won't cover those debts. It will only cover other debts, medical debts, and, for example, debt that you need to pay off in one go. So it was really limited. It was unregulated. Administrators didn't have set requirements. So it was really a failed process, and it still is a failed process. And it doesn't cover all your consumer credit, and due to its limit of the amount. Now, after the South African National Credit Act came into operation fully in 2007, we introduced something that South Africa did not have. We did not have debt counseling and debt restructuring. Now, the debt restructuring, debt counseling, I'll deal with that in a minute. It's the normal process where it's structured by our courts. It could be the lower courts as well as our higher courts. And there again, you need money to restructure your debt and to pay that off. So if you have no income, debt counseling and debt restructuring will probably not work for you. In the Act, we also introduced something that it would seem that only South Africa has that. I'm not aware of any other country that has that. This is a special rule called a statutory in duplum rule. What that entails is once a consumer is in default, in arrears, the interest on the other side is only allowed to accumulate up to equal of the principal debt. So if I can show you this. So it does not mean that you cannot ask more interest on your debt. It's only when a consumer defaults, and that interest, cost of credit, insurance, administration, legal fees, if that mounts up, our law says you must stop. And you can't claim more if you're a creditor. And the idea behind this is to force creditors to claim from consumers and not to allow them that the debt pile up and pile up. You can only start claiming again once they take a summons and they take a judgment. So this is a unique rule. It's there to protect the consumer as a form of debt relief, because then you know if you default, it can't accumulate more on the other side of the interest against the principal debt that was borrowed. So for small accounts, small amounts, this will run very fast if you take legal fees into consideration. We have a common law one from our Roman Dutch law that is still in law. It doesn't deal with the credit, consumer credit, it deals with all debt. And there it's only the interest once that accumulates. But with the new statutory one, it includes all the other costs, initiation fees, service fees. So it's really to force credit providers to act quickly against consumers, and also consumers will know this is what they're in for if they default. But as I said, it doesn't mean that you cannot claim more than the principal debt if the person is continuing paying. But it is important to stop that spiral of you staying in debt the whole time. So that's something unique. Now, if we come back to over-indebtedness and debt review, as I said, that's a new process that South Africa received when the National Credit Act came into operation. We have a National Consumer Tribunal that deals with many aspects, not only on credit, they also deal with some consumer protection in terms of our Consumer Protection Act of goods as well. But their main focus was initially only to deal with consumer credit. And they may declare a consumer over-indebted, and then they structure that. They can postpone the installments. The one thing they can't do is they cannot reduce interest rate, but they can reduce the installments, extend the period, and they can even do and say that some agreements are reckless lending. In South Africa, you cannot lend to a consumer unless you do a proper assessment to see whether the consumer can actually afford to repay the debt. And this process works with a consumer can either wait until someone sues him and then he can raise that he's over-indebted, or he can go to a debt counsellor prior to that and then ask for debt counselling. As I said, the process, they can do different things. They can also determine that the person is not really over-indebted, and then they can still proceed with normal enforcement action. But this whole process is not a write-off of debt. Again, you need regular income to qualify for debt restructuring. So it is also limited. The difference with this one is you won't stay in a debt spiral, because usually they have an end on when they estimate that the person will be able to come out of debt review. But as I said, you need money. Now with the pandemic, a lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of people are not getting paid at this point. So debt structuring, debt review like this is not really adequate. And as I said, with sequestration or bankruptcy or insolvency, again, you need to show in South Africa that it's going to be to the benefit, and you need assets to lodge the claim. So it is difficult at this point to have any of these mechanisms really assist with debt. So now South Africa has three processes: the administration orders, the debt restructuring, and then filing for insolvency or bankruptcy. Now, something else that South Africa introduced, it is in effect, it's not in effect yet, it has been introduced to our National Credit Act. It's a special mechanism to deal with debt on a specific group of consumers. So we refer to it as debt intervention. It's very similar to debt rearrangement or restructuring that we currently have. But in this one, it's capped, very similar to the administration order. And what they've capped it as is, again, 50,000, where they got the amount for 50,000 South African rand, or in Brazilian currency real, 15,830. It's a very small amount, even in South Africa. I'm not sure why they decided on that such a small, so it's really catering for the low-income consumers. And it will only apply to unsecured credit. So if the consumer has an asset that he has pledged to the bank, they won't be able to use this process. And they've also made another requirement that the consumer must not earn more than 7,500 rand, and in Brazilian that will be 2,375. So again, a very small amount. In South Africa, that counts for about 70% of our population earning low income on that. So it would be domestic workers, security guards, cleaners. So it's a process to assist them. And the process will only be available if there was a drastic change in their circumstances. For example, retrenchment. So one could say that this is probably something to consider for the pandemic. As I said, it's not in operation yet. So and it also applies to people for 6 months who have received no income. Again, something similar to what we are seeing with the pandemic at the moment. Now, it has drawbacks. High-income consumers will not be able to use this. How the process works is they also try to get the consumers to repay the debt. But what they do is they can suspend the agreements. They can suspend it for 8 months, and then they review the financial position of the specific low-income consumers who do not have assets to sell and see whether their position has changed. Initially, they can get a suspension of 12 months up to a maximum of 2 years, so 24 months. If the consumer can still not repay that, and ideally they work on a 5-year period for repayment, then the National Credit Regulator will run this and they can extinguish the debt. In other words, debt-free, they will get a discharge from their debt on this process. Now, in South Africa, I think it's probably similar in Brazil. There is a need for such a process for low-income consumers. And you might have heard the terms NINA or ninja cases. Those are your consumers, no income, no job, or no income, no job, and no assets, who are too poor to file for bankruptcy. Now, consumers and consumers are looking forward to this process, but banks obviously not, because that is a big portion of banks, and they might end up with the debt being written off and being discharged. And after a certain period of time, the consumers can still borrow money again in this process. There is oversight by courts and a tribunal on this, and the process is also free. So it is something that could help with the pandemic. The only drawbacks, again, it's capped at that amount and that low income. So high income consumers who have also lost their jobs now will not be able to make use of this at this point. So the process should ideally be open for all consumers, especially I think during this pandemic where people have lost their jobs, not due to their own fault. So really, the whole debt structuring process in South Africa, the formal one, open for everyone, is a bit complicated and only deals with consumer credit. So your debt at medical practices, etc., will fall outside of our traditional debt restructuring. In my view, you can't really do a proper debt restructuring if you're only dealing with credit, consumer credit. You also have other debts that you might want to pay. And that process is unlimited, the general one. The debt intervention pending one is capped. So it is one option, and I won't be surprised if South Africa introduces and makes this come into operation soon with our current situation. Now, if we look at the landscape currently with South Africa is a fairly small country in Africa, and currently we're standing at 58.78 million South Africans, and that was in the middle of last year, according to Stats South Africa. So we're probably close to 60 million at this point. Now, unemployment prior to COVID was already high. It was 30.1% for the first quarter of this year. So it's pre-lockdown, pre-COVID. And that is the official. And there's also some discrepancy in how do you determine unemployed adults. I think probably the same problem in Brazil. Now, in South Africa, we went in early lockdown. We had a declared state of national disaster on the 27th of March. On 15th March, and we went into a hard lockdown as classified as a level 5 in South Africa. Limited movement, very limited emergency services open, shops, only basically supermarkets were open for food. Now, it's estimated, we're at a level 3 now, so it's a little bit more movement. Restaurants are slowly opening, but a lot of industries are still closed, like tourism, traveling, etc. And we are estimating that we will stand at a 50% unemployment rate, according to the African Chamber of Commerce. Of course, that's just an estimate. And then we were estimated of 10 million adults were unemployed before the pandemic. That's classified of ages 16 plus, so it's a little bit younger than from 18. And we are estimating that another 7 million adults will be unemployed. And the banks have, just our statistics, we're not at the level of Brazil yet. On Sunday, we were at 445,000. We're now over 450. Our deaths are still fairly low. And it's probably due because we went into lockdown very early in the pandemic. Now, if we look at how has that impacted on the credit providers, when we went into lockdown on 27 March, the hot lockdown, banks were still deemed to be emergency service providers. So they were allowed to have certain branches open. They was deemed to be emergency service operators, and they waived certain ATM fees for different banks if you draw at a different bank to accommodate the consumers, and also electronic payment systems were all up and running. Now, what the banking sector did, what the government did, the first thing they did is they issued regulations to exempt all the banks from competition laws. And they advised the banks that they could work together to assist consumers with their levels of debt. A lot of consumers were not earning, they all went on unemployment, unpaid leave, or they were temporarily laid off. And the banks worked together and they all provided something they called a payment holiday. So initially it was for 3 months and it ended in June. that consumers were not obliged to pay back any debt, car debt or mortgages, etc., or credit cards. And they have now said after that deadline, the situation has not changed. In fact, it's worse now. And they said that consumers could contact the banks and arrange with them for more payment holidays on that. So the debts are not written off. The repayment has just been postponed. They've also reduced in some instances. So these are all informal things they were allowed to do. And they offer these to consumers that were in good standing. So if you were in good standing, you didn't have any arrears, then you could make use of this. They could also extend your repayment dates a bit, or they make the amounts lower. And they also indicated they would not repossess any assets like mortgages during this lockdown period. And they could also extend certain emergency credit lines for consumers. But again, this only applied to people with good standing. So if you already had a lot of arrears, I'm not sure how the banks dealt with that. A lot of the banks then didn't really tell everyone what they did. They said to consumers, come and see us, and they make out an individual plan on that. There's nothing legislated on that. Now, the Banking Association of South Africa has indicated in the latest statement at the end of 27 June that they had already advanced 18 billion, just over 18 billion South African rand. The rand is about 4 to the Brazilian real. And the banks assisted 2.5 million consumers, individual consumers, out of 2.9 million applications. Again, so it's not a write-off. They just relaxed the repayment terms of the periods. Now, the other lenders, non-banks, micro-lenders, they were not allowed to operate under the hard lockdown at level 5. So they could not see consumers during the first period. It was about 3 or 4 weeks that we were in a hard lockdown. They could only operate under level 4 and 3. Now, they also extended informally to all their consumers. It's not very transparent, but they have accommodated their consumers as well individually with similar things, depending on their own risk and policy profiles. Now, a big thing that the micro-lenders, non-banks, and the banks have all advanced and promoted to consumers is to use their credit life insurance products on their debt. Now, again, that is something that is often offered to low-income consumers to take out credit life insurance for their credit, should they be retrenched so that they could repay their debt. Now, in the past, the credit providers were sometimes sneaky and didn't advise consumers that they had this protection. So now it's a change where they promote this for consumers to use that to get out of debt. So if we look at the traditional debt measures that South Africa has, again, all those procedures, you need regular income, or you need money, or you need assets. And that is the problem at this current point. And the debt intervention that could properly assist is not available yet. Now, in South Africa, the credit bureaus are strictly regulated also by the National Credit Act. The Act regulates the type of information that is kept and the periods that adverse negative listings of consumers may be kept. For example, legal action has been taken, or the consumer has absconded, or has been filed for bankruptcy, etc. And that is all regulated. Consumers now have access to that. They can get a free annual report from each and every single credit bureau that is registered in South Africa. Now, a problem with this is that consumers have raised and banks have raised, and the National Credit Regulator is, what happens if you go for and you apply for a payment holiday? How will that affect your credit bureau report? And will that make you a risky consumer? And the credit providers have all said, because debt bureaus keep positive and negative information, and they work on a score. And all the credit providers work with different types of score bands to predict the possibility of default for consumers. Now, the credit bureaus have all indicated that this will not at this point negatively affect their credit bureau or their credit score given to that. They will only list payment holiday, so they will extend the future date of when the payment needs to be made. And if the terms have been extended, they will indicate that on your report, but not that it negatively affects your credit score, because in South Africa, it's compulsory for credit providers to ask for your credit report to determine your repayment history. It's compulsory. So that is very important. But eventually, the situation, I think, will deteriorate so much that eventually it will negatively affect their credit scores when they don't meet the new amended dates. Now, what government has done, they have decided that they will issue regulations banning any form of blacklisting during the pandemic. Now, of course, the downside of that is that it might make credit more expensive, because credit providers will now realize, if this goes through, that some of the information might not be reliable anymore if it's being banned. And that might drive up the cost of credit. Now, in South Africa, we had two sets of regulations that we called it credit amnesty that was given. It wasn't the written off of debt or repayments, but what South Africa did is they issued regulations that certain information, adverse listings, had to be removed. Initially, it was done when the regulator started regulating credit bureaus. So everyone was in favor of that, because consumers could not contest the information, and that was correct initially. So everyone was in favor that the records be cleaned up initially. Then at some point later, they also had another regulation coming in where certain adverse regulations had to be removed. It wasn't too extreme. For example, it was if a judgment was repaid, the regulation said it could be removed. So the debt was not written off, but if it was repaid, they felt that they could remove that from the information. But again, that they also did with the second set, when they did that credit amnesty regulations, it turned out that the consumers that they removed the adverse information for were in default again, and they were blacklisted again. So it seems to be the same consumers defaulting. Now, obviously, now we're sitting with a different situation where it's no fault of the consumers defaulting if they do not earn any income. So one will have to weigh up the information being reliable versus no fault due to the consumers. Now, they have not published this regulations yet, but it is in the pipeline that we will see this as a form of government trying to protect the consumers. And as I said, one concern is that it might have the negative unintended consequence of restricting access to credit if consumers are concerned about the profile of the consumer. Another initiative that government has done, we haven't seen these regulations yet. They're planning to issue regulations to assist consumers that are part of the affordable housing lenders group. And those are consumers that have borrowed from the National Housing Finance Corporation. And it seems like they will also bring something out where it seems like a payment holiday or rearrangement. So not specifically dealing with the National Credit Act, but a specific group of vulnerable consumers that they seem to be accommodating, and also to not penalize them if they cannot repay at this point. And then something else that this Department of Human Settlements are issuing, because in South Africa, access to housing is a big problem. A lot of people are homeless. Also rental relief that are in these rental financial distress for certain consumers that are renting these properties. Now, under lockdown 5, when South Africa went into that, we were not allowed to evict any rentals at that point. Tenants were not allowed to be removed from the property for non-payment. That only changed under the later levels we are currently in. They said they will publish these for rental and the affordable housing. We have not seen that yet, but it is in the process. Now, other than relief, just general relief that consumers receive generally, we had various interest rate cuts. The repo rate, the rate that the Reserve Bank or our central bank lends to banks, is currently at 3.5 after the cuts. So it's very low for South Africa. And the prime lending rate that good consumers will probably lend at is around 7%. So it's still fairly high compared to other countries, but we had 3 interest rate cuts to accommodate. We also have the unemployment insurance fund that they made available for employees under special benefits to assist with the pandemic, not only for unemployment, but it was also for people not receiving their money up to a certain maximum. Another thing government issued was social grants to unemployed consumers that were not earning anything, and it was a very small, it's still a small amount, but the numbers are large of the people receiving these grants. In Brazilian, it will be 112 reals, so it's not a lot, basically just to buy a little bit of food. Then some insurance companies reduced their insurance premiums, especially for cars, because they were saying there's not a lot of movement, people were not using their cars. School fees were reduced for those who lost employment, but you had to apply for that. And also certain premiums for holders of certain private medical funds were reduced when people lost their jobs. Just like Brazil, South Africa do not have a very good public medical infrastructure. Public hospitals are not that great. So higher incomes will make use of private medical funds. So they try to accommodate. Some of the medical funds did that. In conclusion, so one can see there's still limited debt relief offered to consumers by the pandemic. We have payment holidays, and the COVID relief offered is only to consumers in good standing. So consumers who had problems before have more problems now, and not all the official ones really assist consumers not earning income, not having assets, and having no jobs. And so the payment holiday offers limited, and still eventually they need to repay this debt. So once the holidays are over, I'm not sure how the consumers will catch up to repay this. And that is where the negative effect will come in, and they will be blacklisted eventually by the credit bureaus. So I think at this point, the only thing consumers can do is to apply for these limited things, and also to regularly check their credit records with their credit bureaus. Annually, they have one that's free and we have various credit bureaus keeping different information. And then I think this is a problem countrywide and worldwide is, despite debt relief, we're still sitting with prices of food going up, utilities have increased. In South Africa, we have not had any relief from municipal utilities being reduced. In fact, they have been increased, and that really negates and the debt relief that is offered. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle, for this wonderful speech that shows us the difference, but also the similarities between the two countries. Thank you very much. I have two questions, so if you allow, I will begin the discussion. And we have some colleagues, judges from our country that perhaps have also questions to you. So may I begin? No? I was very impressed with this sui generis idea that you have a cap, a double possibility to help the consumers to see what they will pay when they go default. You have this. I don't know where I wrote this, but it was a very interesting idea that we don't know this in Brazil. So perhaps you can give us more information what can be in this double sum of the principal from the credit. I understand it was fees, but also lawyers' fees. If you can give us more details. And my second observation is about the non-income, non-assets. No? That now with the COVID outbreak will be very large. I can give you some numbers from Brazil. We have officially 13% of unemployment, but the real number will be 16% of. But this means, I think, it means 38 million persons. 17 million persons have not lost the job, but they lost the possibility to look for a job because they lost the job before. And I think the rest are really unemployed. And a lot of other persons, 8 million, have been suspended. The work contract has been suspended. So I think your ideas that perhaps South Africa and also Brazil needs a special way to debt relief for non-income, non-access will be really interesting me and also the audience. What do you think will be the best way to deal with these persons that have no income at the moment? Perhaps a holiday, I don't know, but I'm very, it will be very useful for us if you can say a little more about this.
Okay, so the rule you spoke about is the statutory in duplum rule,
Yes.
The rule against interest. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So we have two rules. The one is for all kinds of debt, and that is only interest will stop. So once a person is in arrears with their principal debt, the interest starts running. And in terms of this rule, even interest that are that is capitalized will still remain interest. So even if it's interest on interest, and that is the common law applying to all kinds of debt, it starts stopping immediately once it reaches the outside the same amount as the principal debt. And it's a policy decision why we have that rule, and it originated from Roman Dutch law, and it's still part of our law. And then you could only demand payment again and sue the person, and then it could start running against your judgment debt. So that is how the normal rule operates. But when the National Credit Act came, we said we wanted more protection to provide indirect debt relief. And we kept not only the interest, but also your fees, your service fees, any administration fees, collection fees, and legal fees. And once all those things in the basket on the one side reach the same amount as the principal debt that is outstanding, it stops to run while the person is in arrears, and can only start running again after you've taken a summons against the consumer, and then it will run against the judgment debt. The interest will start running again, because then it becomes a judgment debt, not a credit debt anymore. So for small accounts, say you take 1,000, which is the principal debt, and the interest on that is also 1,000 plus collection fees is 2,000. Then the credit provider will only be able to claim the 1,000 for the principal debt and 1,000 for the interest fees combinedly, and will never be more than 2,000 then that the credit provider will claim. And the reason is for that, because a lot of credit providers will allow the consumer to stay in arrears, and then they end up paying a little bit and a little bit and a little bit of the interest. So they remain in a debt trap forever. And the credit provider makes money by not taking legal action, because legal action will be too expensive to claim. And they basically make money from consumers staying in this debt trap forever. And the idea is to force the credit provider to take action sooner against these small accounts, and to also protect. So it's a balancing between the two interests, and then to protect the consumer, that he will know, should I default, I'm in for a 2,000 maximum, and then only the interest will run on the judgment debt, whichever percentage that debt will be in your country. So it's basically something that cuts both ways. Credit providers do not like that rule, but it is here to stay, and it's a good indirect method to get rid of debt for consumers. So if it's a big debt and you borrow $1 million, it's going to take a long time for the costs of credit to run up. Then on the other one, no job, no income, no assets. I think that is where the payment holidays will only have a limited application for that, because eventually they'll have to repay. And that is where the problem will start. If the economies do not recover, we don't know what's going to happen with the pandemic. And that, I think, is where a wait-and-see approach is probably more useful, like the debt intervention that we have, but that is not in operation yet, where you suspend that for a period, where the consumer can show that he is looking for employment, then postpone it to a maximum period. Of course, again, the credit providers will not like this, but what can they do at this point if you don't have income, you don't have assets? Consumers can't get, I'm not sure how it works in Brazil, they can't file for bankruptcy because that's expensive. They're basically too poor to go for bankruptcy, and there will be nothing for the credit providers. So I think realistically, the debt intervention is probably the best way to go with this, but also to limit consumers taking chances on this and abusing the system to get rid of the debt again. So it's going to be that balancing act again, but not much else we can do at this point.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I want to see if there are more questions from the floor. Professor Anna? Mm-hmm.
A question?
Please.
Michel, pleasure to meet you. Thank you for the brilliant today. Hi for my Professor Cloud and Diana Scaff, all the students. I teach consumer protection in South, and now I work with Professor Cloud. I am very pleased. In the current scenario, could hire more services, payments, deposits, is the service by fintech more better concept the rates are, and there is the use of artificial intelligence. How the professor sees scenario?
Thanks a lot, Professor Anna. We are not hearing very well. Perhaps you can send the question by written, will be better. I want to, we have some questions from the students. Perhaps you can write, and yes. Marcela can make the questions from the students, and then we come back.
Yes. My classmate, Angelo, he is from Guinea-Bissau. He's asking Professor Michel, what lesson will the pandemic leave for Africa? It's a very general question. I don't know if maybe you could answer about Africa or Africa do Sul, South Africa, but I think it's an interesting question.
I think there are, of course, I can only speak about South Africa, not Africa, but there are many lessons for South Africa. I think the first one is it has shown the inequality between the low-income group and the higher income group. For people losing their jobs in the low-income group, they can ill afford that to lose their jobs, whereas more higher income have got buffers. Not losing their houses so immediately like low-income consumers. So it really illustrates the inequality in our society at this point. And it's also demonstrated if you look at the health system on us, not only for debt, is that if you have access to private medical care versus public, that is also a problem. Food security for low-income consumers have been a huge problem. A lot of our COVID relief is currently going for food parcels. Also, a lot of consumers do not have access to water, and that is a big problem during the pandemic. So I think it's showing us a lot of social issues, not only debt, but also social. And also the other thing, I think that's probably the same for Brazil. Social distancing is a problem in highly dense communities where people stay in shacks or squatter camps. I think that would be the same for Brazil. And the pandemic seems to also hit hard in areas where there's high density. So a lot of social lessons to be learned.
Thank you, Professor Michel. Thank you very much. I think Professor Ana Paula, she's typing, so maybe...
Yeah. I have another question related to this last one, because I think we have also similarities in the legal moment, because also in Brazil we try to the parliament try to regulate a banning of scoring or a credit scoring during the pandemic, but the Brazilian government, the President Bolsonaro, has made a veto, a total veto on the law. And also in another emergent law that we try to have also a banning of eviction of the tenants. Also, the Bolsonaro government has made a total veto of these rules, no? Social rules, we can say. Yeah? And then my question is it possible that perhaps if you can send us some of the South Africa legislation, especially this one that is will be enforced in the future, no? We can use this and send to the Brazilian Parliament to try again some of these issues to become a law. And we are trying also to make the reform of our consumer code during the pandemic outbreak. And it's really very, very difficult. We are not succeeding, but we are still trying, of course. But I think there are similarities also in the political moment, perhaps, between the two countries.
So let me read Professor Ana Paula question. Professor Claudia, Professor Ana Paula is saying, in this current scenario, consumers tend to hire more fintech services, payment, financing, deposit, insurance. So her question is, the services offered by fintechs may be more beneficial to the consumers, considering that the rates are lower.
Yes, I think that is also one of the lessons that we learned. And also the South Africa, the lower income prefers cash, obviously, because a lot of them do not have bank accounts. But the pandemic has forced consumers to make more use of fintech. And the thing used most in South Africa and in Africa is often a mobile phone. That is the tool that a lot of consumers have to especially in rural areas where they don't have banks or traditional banks. And a lot of bank branches are not open, but you're right, fintech is a useful tool. We even use these fintech things to do credit assessments when consumers don't have bank accounts. But again, you're using all kinds of algorithms to determine whether a consumer can pay, making use of retail award cards to see, look at spending, etc. And also move away from cash because of the pandemic and the risk associated with cash. So fintech is something I think worldwide that will pick up now, especially with online shopping. People not wanting to go out. But again, that also shows the inequality of low-income consumers not having access to technology, again, versus more sophisticated consumers.
Thank you very much. I have also a question about the public utilities. I was very impressed that the public utilities in South Africa have become more expensive and not with payment holidays. And so in Brazil, in this part, we had the government agencies have, special for water and energy, they have suspended for 3 months the payment for poor income groups and the social rates, we can say so. And also the cut of the utilities, they also ban the cut. Perhaps you can illustrate us more about this, how is the utility service in South Africa is doing?
In South Africa, we have many challenges with electricity, not enough supply, various reasons. So we still sit with load shedding, often a couple of days where we don't have electricity, or a couple of hours on a day that we do not have electricity. And they are trying to fix that, but we have a big problem of non-payment with the lower income consumers. And at this point, the low income consumers are outweighing the paying consumers. And the negative effect is they've increased it just now, this month, which then again leads to less people being able to pay, because that's the first thing they usually cut with non-payment, that also with rates and taxes on properties, especially with the people that lost their jobs. So we're going to see a bigger rate of defaults on utilities, I think, if I had to guess. And we also have a lot of striking workers and a strong workforce, and promises were made for increases. And they've implemented that despite the fact that the income has been lowered. So many political problems at this point. Unfortunately, they should have at least kept the utility prices the same, but they've increased it. So we'll have to see how that plays out at this point.
Thank you very much. There's also a big problem in Brazil, utilities, but at the moment is really not so. They are doing well in this specific point, of course. Well, we have more questions.
Yes, Teodoro is asking Professor Michel, what measures could South Africa take to prevent a second wave? And let me make you a question as well. Here in Brazil, we have a huge problem with the harassment of consumption, especially the banks, with the elder people, with their retirement money. And nowadays, with this the pandemic situation, they get more aggressive. So I would like to know if South Africa has the same issue, and if you have any laws or anything to protect these elder people from this kind of harassment. Thank you.
I'm not an expert on the pandemic.
No problem. Just share your vision with us. We'll be fine.
But I think we're still busy with the first wave. We haven't seen the first wave peak yet. Estimates are for the end of August. But I think we still have a lot to see on that. It's all estimated still. We're growing at about 13,000 to 7,000 infections per day, but I'm not sure if our testing is so up to the same standard or number than other countries. So it's very difficult to say, but we are still busy with the first wave at this point. Then the harassment of consumers and elderly, I think this links in with literacy. Because we have the National Credit Act that places a moratorium on a lot of the debt collection. Our regulator is quite strict with preventing consumers being harassed. The same with evictions. Obviously, there were landlords that did evict people during lockdown, etc. The same with debt collection. And this is the case where consumers, if they're not aware of their rights and they're not literate, credit consumer literate, then you have the problem with consumers. And that has been a challenge in South Africa. A lot of the elderly will still not be even normal literate to read, yet alone be aware of what their consumer rights are. A lot of headway has been made, but I think at this point, government is not focusing on credit literacy as much as educating people on staying safe and healthy during the pandemic. So this is the big challenge I think a lot of countries sit with. Brazil will probably have the same problem with financial literacy and consumers knowing what their laws are. I mean, this act have been in operation for over 10 years. We are still trying to educate consumers, especially the elderly, the vulnerable, low-income consumers, on their rights.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Michel.
Thank you very much. I have a last question. It's about the regulator. I did not understand well if in South Africa you have a specific financial regulator like in the US, or they are a common consumer law regulators, and then for the utilities and so on.
In South Africa, we have a national credit regulator that regulates all credit providers, banks and non-banks. So anyone that's in the sphere of lending to consumers needs to be registered with the credit regulator. So they are the governing body. And above them, we have, or parallel to that, we have the Central Reserve Bank that would regulate banks additionally as well. And we've just moved to the Twin Peaks system, like Australia and some of the other countries, where we have the Reserve Bank, which is the prudential authority regulating banks. And we also have the financial sector regulator, which deals more with a conduct regulator, which deals with the conduct in the financial system. Everyone, the insurers, etc., will be governed by that. And the banks. So we have the Twin Peaks, but in South Africa, we basically have 3 peaks, because the National Credit Regulator works together with those regulators, but also independently, whereas other countries, the consumer credit regulators will fall under their prudential credit regulator. So we say we're Twin Peaks, but we're basically in 3 peaks, if we have to be more correct with that. But it's a new system. We only recently moved to Twin Peaks. Prior to that, we had the central bank, the Reserve Bank, regulating banks, the National Credit Regulator regulating everyone, and we had the Financial Services Board, which regulated market conduct, sharing, trading, etc. So they've all now been separated in Twin Peak systems. So we're still figuring out this Twin Peak application, but we're the only developing country that implemented the Twin Peaks. So in that regard, we're the trendsetter because Twin Peaks have been incorporated only in developed countries so far. So we'll have to see whether that is a better system than what we had, because we were kind of buffered with the financial crisis in 2008, 2007, because the National Credit Act came in and we were not so overexposed at that point.
Thank you, but it's very interesting to see how it's developing this system, and if it's positive, has positive effects. So it's really very interesting. I received some notes for the students asking if it's possible to send to us some South Africa legislation. We have a project with Angelo and other students from Africa. We are trying to make model law for consumer protection for the country that speaks Portuguese in Africa. No? So we are studying the models in Mozambique, Angola, and so etc. But I think some of South Africa legislation is also very interesting to take account. If you can send us, we will be really thankful, and will be very helpful. Thank you very much. I give the floor then to Marcela to thank you in name of the students for this wonderful moment. Thank you very much, Michelle.
Professor Michelle, thank you so much on behalf of all our students, the CDEA, the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul as well, that are here with us. It was a very rich, fruitful discussion. Certainly you added a lot of knowledge to us. So thank you. It was a great honor to have you here with us.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting me. Thank you. Bye.
Bye, and be safe. Huh?
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much, Professor.